Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, a lot of people are still questioning how it is that the Federal Reserve needed inflation in order to survive. I know this is probably my own theory and nobody else is really talking about this. But ultimately, if the Federal Reserve did not get the inflation scenario that we are experiencing today, they probably would have gone out of business. Now, I doubt that would have been the case, when I think about it, like the Federal Reserve would have found another way in order to achieve their monetary policies. But ultimately, it was the pandemic and the government's overreaction to it that gave the Federal Reserve the ability to do what it is that they were doing. It was the unusual and exigent circumstances. But in this video, I want to describe why it is and how it is that the Federal Reserve was going to go out of business or fail or just unable to succeed in their monetary policies had they not achieved the inflation scenario that we are experiencing today. So now I want to start this off with a speech coming from John Williams. Now, if you follow my channel for any length of time, you've heard me cover this information in the past. This is not new to you, but it is going to be explained in a way that maybe helps to understand that the Federal Reserve needed the inflation scenario. All right. Now, let me read this little passage out of the John Williams speech. This is dated November 30th. It's Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. It says, today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Think about that again. I'm going to read it one more time. Ironically, the problem we need to solve today, or the problem we need to solve these days, is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Now, this is very odd for a lot of people to think about. Like, they can't understand how it is or why it is that the Federal Reserve would want inflation to be persistently high, right? Because it is persistently too low rather than too high. And now, if I go and refer back to this Jerome Powell speech given August of 2020, and the title of this speech is New Economic Challenges and the Fed's Monetary Policy Review. Now stick with me for just a second here, because the persistent undershoot of inflation, listen to this, the persistent undershoot of inflation from our 2% long run objective is a cause for concern. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, and shelter, and to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. However, inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risks to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which, in turn, can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. Okay. Now remember, again, this is Jerome Powell in August of 2020. This is just as the pandemic was kicking in, before inflation started happening. He is talking about how inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risk to the economy. John Williams, 2 years earlier, was saying that inflation, the problem that we need to solve today or these days, is a risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Now, later on in John Williams' speech, Monetary Policy for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World, he has this to say: what does a low neutral rate mean for monetary policy and the anchoring of inflation expectations? When a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below the neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates. This shortfall in monetary accommodations would result in less desirable economic outcomes during the recession and recovery. In particular, inflation would typically undershoot its desired target during these episodes. The persistence of below target inflation rates in many advanced economies over the past decade is a testament to this dynamic. So now, when we think about this for just a little bit, the Federal Reserve was sitting in a position in which that they were facing a problem of inflation that is too low rather than too high. And John Williams talks about inflation that is persistently too low can pose serious risk to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in a long-run term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower and resulting in the adverse cycle of ever lower inflation and inflation expectations. So these guys were facing some serious issues with it. And the major problem with it is the low neutral interest rate. And this is where it really becomes key, because everybody really has grown accustomed to the way the Federal Reserve had operated up until just recently, up until the last 10 years, really, or 15, really, when you think about it. The Federal Reserve had, like back in the Volcker days, right? Last time we had inflation that was this ungodly high. Volcker raised interest rates at the Fed funds level to 15%, 20%. He shot it up incredibly high. I can't remember the exact number where it landed. Now, this was the way that he had combated the inflation expectations. It was so high, they were able to run the interest rates incredibly high in order to combat this. Right? Now, the idea behind it is that you would back off on consuming, right? The consumer would not be able to borrow this much money or be able to borrow as much money, and by not borrowing as much money, you would not be out there participating in the economy. I mean, this is kind of what the idea behind it was. Now, every time that they would lower interest rates, what they were doing is making the economy less restrictive. And then as things started to heat up, they would have to restrict the economy again. And this is where the job losses would pick up and fall. Now, in order to combat inflation, the Federal Reserve would be looking at jobs, because up until about 15 years ago, if there was a lot of jobs in the economy, that would pick up the inflation. And so a recession would have to kick in to bring in more job losses, raise the unemployment, and bring the inflation down. So really, the Federal Reserve was looking at how many active jobs were taking place, and there was a neutral rate for unemployment. I mean, the Federal Reserve talks about this. Now, so just stick with me for just a second, because now what's happened is that as time has gone on, and they've made the economy or the interest rates less restrictive, right? Over time, the interest rates have fallen so close to zero that now the neutral interest rate, which is the rate that is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy, is so low that the Fed cannot drop the interest rates far enough below it to stimulate the economy without hitting the lower bound, which is zero. Okay? So you think about it, when they had interest rates quite elevated back in the early 80s, anytime that the economy needed any kind of stimulus, or any kind of encouragement to become more active, they could lower interest rates, and there was all kinds of room to move. Now they are at a very low interest rate and hitting the lower bound of zero. This is the reason why they needed inflation, in order to get the interest rates elevated, for them to have more scope, however. Let me see how John. Let me see here. Oh, I can't find it right off here. But in Jerome Powell's speech, he talks about how it encourages the scope of their capabilities, right? In order to combat a recession, they would have to be able to drop interest rates far enough or well enough below the neutral interest rate, or a significant amount, in order to stimulate the economy. And this is where they had failed. Like, once they had hit zero on their effective funds rate, there was no more room. And so now, when it comes to inflation expectations, when inflation expectations is running hot, it leads into actual inflation. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if they could spark a little bit of inflation expectation and keep that rolling, that would then give them the ability to then move their interest rates up into a higher level, one that it would be more appropriate for their monetary policy. And they do it in a way that is like, I mean, I don't know how to say, it's not secret because it's right here. I mean, they're stating it straight up, but it is so like misunderstood by the people, believing that they are doing this to try and combat inflation when actually it was inflation that they were needing, right? Because that was what John Williams was saying back, before, is that they had a persistently too low of inflation rather than too high. Now they have a inflation expectation that is running persistently high, and it's right in line with everything that they need, including the raising of their Fed funds rates in order to have the scope, in order to facilitate a stimulus package or a stimulated economy next time there is an economic downturn. So I think I got that. Uneducated Economist, you let me know.